Back, you can't see me. Yeah, that doesn't work. Or see you. Excuse me. Can you just see if the camera has you?
That's good.
Does that work?
Yep.
All right.
Let's
Okay.
see if it has you.
So, welcome to the Datapalooza stream. Unofficial, but only, as I'd like to say. So, the idea for this came about. We were talking with Academy Health, I think about 6 months ago, and what we were saying is, we know that patients are going to have trouble coming to this. Datapalooza has always been patient-centric. It's always been, which I know is a problematic term, but they've done a good job making patients feel like peers to the people at the conference, and making sure the patients on the main stage, and making sure that patients were given scholarships so they could afford to come. And they've really done a fabulous job over the years. But we're in the middle of a pandemic, we're in the middle of a recession, and so that means it's expensive, too expensive for some patients, and for others they can't come because they're immunocompromised or they get COVID. So there's a bunch of patients who couldn't make it because they got COVID immediately before. And in order to compensate for this, we were like, well, why don't we just stream the whole conference?
Sure.
Which is great, except it's exorbitantly expensive, way out of the budget. And so we thought, well, is there a way for us to get around this massive expense that's required to do live streaming at a conference, which I think there's a monopoly or something in Washington, D.C. for this. I'm not sure exactly why it's exorbitantly expensive, but it is exorbitantly expensive. And it's true, and no matter what hotel you choose, right? So they can't pick a venue based on who's got good streaming capabilities or inexpensive. So we decided is to rent a suite in order to have a live streaming kind of content to bring as many of the patients and speakers and people who wanted to be speakers but couldn't be speakers, and anybody who had something to say that was interesting and was relevant to patients who were watching online in real time, but also patients who are watching online in the future, so that this would be free content coming out of Datapalooza. So that's the idea. That's why we're here. That's what we're doing.
Okay.
With that in mind, I would love to introduce you and for you to explain why you are an ideal person to be on a patient-focused Datapalooza stream.
Well, hi. There's a camera, right?
There's
Hi.
a camera. I think the microphone's coming from there too.
Okay. How are you? My name is Danny Van Leeuwen, and I'm known as Health Hats. And I'm known as Health Hats because I'm a person with multiple sclerosis. I've been a care partner to several family members' end of life. I'm a nurse. I have led several EMR implementations. I have been in the C-suite of healthcare. I'm a musician. I wear a lot of hats. And I'm a podcaster and a videographer, and my tag is learning together on the journey to best health. And I'm on the board of governors of PCORI, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. So I do a lot.
Yeah. Right now I wanted to start out showing the website, because the last time I was supposed to show a website, I forgot. So I wanted to start by remembering.
Right. Thank you.
So I'm looking at this website here. So first of all, what a gorgeous picture.
It's Grand Canyon, Colorado River.
It's a really lovely picture. And
okay,
Creative
so
Commons.
Let's look at that. So
Okay.
I'm Creative Commons. What that means is that anything that I create is free use. I like to be recognized for what gets used, but I do not claim any intellectual property.
Yeah, so you don't have to pay, you just have to acknowledge.
Right.
That's totally reasonable.
Right.
And it looks like there's some blog posts.
Right. And so what you're seeing here is I'm doing a series right now on emerging adults with mental illness. And I've started with people with lived experience. And this person here is, so I started with a young man with mental illness, and then his mother, and then a young lady, and now a teacher, a high school teacher. And then after my next episode, which is about my trip to Costa Rica, I will then have a primary care physician and an ED. So sort of doing concentric or circles around, expanding. That's what's what I'm doing right now.
And you have a podcast, YouTube channel. It looks like there's a bunch of ways to get a hold of you.
Well, I one of the things that I am fascinated by is that people take in information differently. That there are readers, there are listeners, there are watchers, and that those are. And I'm intrigued by the challenge. Every episode I do has all three components, and they're different. It's the same content, but they're different experiences. And then there's people who have, challenges with their hearing or their vision, or they come from different worlds. Since I wear a lot of hats, people come from different worlds, and so what's sort of a common denominator that helps the content be interesting and relevant to people. So that's my shtick.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
So we were just in with Don Rucker,
Yes.
who is a former Office of Master Coordinator, and he's working with a company that now has fire-based. I think they focused on the payer space protocols, and it seemed like they were doing very well. And Don is a very eloquent proponent of. I think he was appointed by out of the Trump administration, presumably kind of the conservative approach towards some of these issues, market-based approaches to solving things. And while you were here, you
Right.
came in and you suggested that perhaps he, and by implication my perspective on health interoperability might be a little optimistic and perhaps by implication naive, perhaps?
No, I would say that whenever anybody says something ought to just be easy after this, I'm like those are like red flags for me.
Oh, I see.
Because that's
so it wasn't
not really
specifically interoperability. It was, once we chop down these trees,
right.
those other trees will be easy to chop down.
Yes.
That basic pattern of
right.
presumption of when things become a downhill slope.
Right. And especially that he was clearly talking about health data. But what he was really talking about was claims and EMR data. And that is such a small piece of health data that the idea that, like, it's not like I don't appreciate all the standardization and understand the value, but it sort of feels to me like we're standardizing data under the streetlight when the data is really in the dark alley. And so congratulations.
Are you making that reference to the joke? Why
Yes.
are you looking
for your keys
or whatever it
right
is?
It's like
But here's what I can see.
Right. It's right. That's the I'm just sort of saying that we do all this work on data that I think is such a tiny part of health data.
So talk to me.
Yeah.
Talk to me about. Well, so first of all, I really want to try to make sure that as much as possible, our content is accessible to the layperson, the patients who might be watching in the future.
Yeah.
Tell me, what is PCORI?
Okay.
Tell me, what is PCORNet? What is the relationship between them?
Okay.
And why I think what you're saying is profound, given the leadership position that you have with PCORNet. I think it's insightful, but take me on a journey and take the audience on a journey of kind of why those things matter.
Okay. So let me I have a caveat. And the caveat is that I'm speaking for myself.
Yep.
That I do not represent PCORI or PCORNet.
Got it.
But I am on the board of governors of PCORI, which is the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, which is a organization that has been twice funded now by Congress for 2 10-year periods, and we're in, I don't know, the third or fourth year of the second 10-year period for patient-centered research, comparative effectiveness research.
And as a caveat, I should point out my company CareSet has received a PCORI scholarship.
Okay.
And so we've gotten money from PCORI. So it does make me a little bit biased towards being, I kind of like PCORI.
Right.
I think it's really cool that we got the scholarship, and our data journalism work has really benefited in the long term
Well, that's
by
great.
getting a little bit by being scholarshiped in the very early days, because the scholarship was for today. We have like I think 30 something, 25 something people who work in our company. We do a massive amount of data analysis on Medicare data. We do it for industry. We do it for data journalism purposes. We do it with researchers. We do it with nonprofits. I mean, we do have done an incredible amount of work. But back then we were 3 or 4 people, and this tiny little scholarship that we got was really, really important. So I really appreciate PCORI. But I guess that technically does mean that I have a bias, and I need to declare that.
I think that I mean, I wouldn't I wouldn't be in this position and um, enjoy it, and so I'll be so honored to be in this position if I didn't really respect what PCORI has done, its leadership, its staff, its mission, because it's work to do this. And but I'm honored. I'm totally honored. I think that I appreciate what you just said about yourself and your experience, because I think that although we do have, to me, being a patient caregiver, a huge budget for research compared to NIH, it's nothing, but still it's big. But I think the art of what we do and have done is to help seed innovation in such as with your company. And for me, being on the board, I'm always thinking about how can we marshal our resources to support innovation. And actually, I think that supporting innovation is cheaper than supporting mature research studies, because people who are innovators are know how to do more with less.
That's right. Well, if we were talking about getting money from PCORI now, it would have to be in the millions. It was not at all in the millions when we got it. It was in the grand scheme of things probably an insubstantial amount of money, but it was given at the right time and had a huge impact.
Yes, and I think that's really important.
And I think that's a pattern. And I don't want any more PCORI money, but what I definitely want is for PCORI and PCORInet to continue to make those kinds of bets where they say this is something that could have legs, and if it did, it would have substantive patient impact. I mean, I think we did supported the Wall Street Journal in some of their investigations of skilled nursing facilities. It's just one of the examples of things that we've done very, very recently. And when we got the PCORI scholarship, never would have imagined that we would grow up to be doing that kind of work. And so I do think that was definitely a kind of an example of seeding innovation. And I think we should probably also, again, for people who are not kind of wonky people, because I know that people who come to Datapalooza tend to be a little bit wonky. They want to know, when I say wonky, I mean interested in policy is what I think policy wonk is the term that I'm shortening. And interested in policies and interested in what the government does and this kind of thing. So I don't know everybody's into that, but PCORI was started because there was a recognition that doing research in a way that was cooperative with patients had a lot of potential, wasn't being done as well as it could have been done through funds to the NIH and everything else. So there was a need to have a new channel. And I think PCORI's done a pretty fair job of meeting that charge, work with patients and, put patients into the research process in a kind of profound way, one way or another. And there's dozens of different ways that I think PCORI has tried. And I think better for you to describe what PCORInet is.
PCORInet.
PCORInet.
Okay.
Excuse me.
So PCORInet is PCORInet is a federation of research entities, clinical subject matter organizations that pool their data and try to. It has a what's called a common data model, which is there a common data set database that can be used across all members of the Confederacy, and so that all that data can be combined and used. And one of the challenges to me, so now I'm speaking for myself, is that just like what the gentleman was talking about here, it's the common data model is focused on claims and EMR data,
And I
with
think it's
all its
I think it is. It's not just
limitations.
EHR; it's the easy parts of the EHR.
Yes, right. Right.
That's important to note. Right?
Okay.
It's like there is a and correct me if you disagree, because maybe I'm miscategorizing that. But when you look at what FHIR is, you are trying to build a community across a consensus about what should be exposed in the EHR, and so you have to kind of think in terms of a common denominator effect, right? So you can have some wonderful part of an EHR that's tracking something really, really well, and it has to collapse down to this common denominator model. And so if, for instance, you are doing partially structured notes in order to kind of get, past kind of what we call a SOAP note, right? And you're doing something better, or you thought of a way to make your EHR really cool. Those really cool features will not be surfaced when you think about FHIR or something else. And instead it's, well, let's try to make all of the EHRs look the same. And let's surface the most obviously valuable, computable, to what Don was saying, computable portions, which is a great approach, but there's a lot of nuance that's missed. And I think the other thing that I think, talking about the street light example, there's a huge amount of information. Of course, my favorite researcher on the topic remains Susanna Fox's work that she did while she was at Pew Research about the information that people track. And she talked to all these people, and she learned about, how do people use information internally to kind of deal with their lives as patients. And I think some of her stuff is still up over at Pew Research. You really should go look at. People should look at that, and I'll try to remember to put her links in the show notes. And she still thinks about and talks about those things. So just going to her blog currently is still a good idea. But I think that's an example of somebody looking in the places that are we're not talking about, like for EHR claims based.
Well, I think that.
Or do you think there's still more places?
Oh, there's way more places. But I think it's, in a way, I sort of think it's the wrong approach that we're taking.
Say what?
Okay. And so I think that, like, for example, I sat on the original Blue Button team, and as a patient caregiver stakeholder.
Okay.
And I advocated for three things over 18 months of weekly calls.
Wow. Okay.
And the three things were that caregivers needed to be included in the care team.
Okay.
In the definition of care team. I was successful on that.
Okay.
That what patients and caregivers really wanted to be in the record is what works for me when I'm in pain and what works for me when I'm scared.
Okay.
And I was successful on one and
Not
had
successful.
Absolutely zero traction on the other two.
Interesting.
And so as I've aged, I appreciate a 300 or a 333 batting average as being good.
Yeah. No,
and so
I
I had success in 1 out of 3 goals that I had. Yet I think the trying to automate and whatever the verb
interoperability
is. Well, anyway,
interoperations
to do that.
Yeah. To interoperate. No,
that does not necessarily answer the questions that people have. is like, okay, it's congratulations, you did that. But we still can't have something in my record that can go from place to place of what works
For
when
you.
I'm in pain
Right.
or what way works when I'm scared.
So
And those are really critical.
no, absolutely, you're absolutely critical. You're preaching to the choir, and actually, just to pause and try to do what I hope I've done an okay job on these streams, is to try to de-vernacular our conversations, because
Okay.
we get into things and it's just so easy to fall into conversations, which we've had
Sure.
many lovely conversations.
Okay.
So, Blue Button
Yes.
is an effort that was started. I think VA and CMS were kind of in early days very central to this, and it was an effort to make data accessible, even though data wasn't ready. This is actually a kind of a revolutionary concept. I really want to emphasize that
Yes.
this was an amazing thing.
It was.
Is there is a chicken or egg problem here, where you say, well, the patients don't have any tools to work with this data. They don't have any apps to work with this data. They don't have, there's none of the infrastructure that we need out there, but we aren't giving them data because they don't have those tools. Well, why don't we have those tools? Well, because the data is not available. So you have this circular thing, like, why don't we have hydrogen cars? Well, we don't have hydrogen cars because we don't have places where you can fill up a car with hydrogen. We don't have hydrogen gas stations. Well, why don't we have any hydrogen gas stations? Well, we don't have any hydrogen gas stations because we don't have any hydrogen cars. So, there's all of these problems that we have as a society where you cannot deploy technology without deploying the supporting infrastructure, and there's no reason to deploy the supporting infrastructure until you're absolutely certain that you do this. And of course, electronic cars are a perfect example of something else that's pushing through. But Blue Button was saying, we know the data is not right. We know that EHR data is problematic. We know that it's limited. We know that it's going to be structured inappropriately. But we're going to give it to patients anyways, because we know that we just have to start somewhere, and you just can't make progress until you've got the data. And of course, what happened inevitably, the story of Blue Button is, first, they released the data. It was basically a kind of text dump from Vista, which was VA Vista as an old school open source EHR that the VA developed internally. And they kind of did the equivalent of a print screen of that record. Like, here, just do a print screen. And then that's what you could download. If you were a veteran and you had a record at the VA, you could go in and press, which was literally a blue button. You press it and you could download it. And then what they knew, and that what would happen is that newer versions of the Blue Button would start to use web standards, and it would use JSON as opposed to something else. And of course, JSON is JavaScript object notation, which is itself kind of a very mature standard. It's a human readable data standard, so you can open up the file and kind of see what's going on, and it's possible to read. And so Blue Button is a story of this ladder kind of really working towards getting patients access to their data. And now, of course, Blue Button is standardized, so it's not just a text dump. There are apps that you can use to do this, and now it's really part of this whole ecosystem that we're talking about. And so, when we say just the word Blue Button in a kind of conversation, which is just just in the hallway of Datapalooza, there's all this context that most of us at least, know the full story and understand the implications, and can just pop this up. What was the other thing?
Well,
another.
Can I let me draw a link between?
Although let me say, I don't know that everyone here understands the implications of why the Blue Button was successful. Because I think the lesson of the Blue Button, you just need to start somewhere, is something that's that is a terrifying place to be, and people still struggle to re-implement that strategy. But go ahead. What was your?
Well, I have so many thoughts. I want to say that the approach of one of the things that I really like about Picori is that the approach has been, what is it that people want to know to help manage their health, and that is the light. We're not perfect by any means. We are learning this, and that's another thing. Is I feel like one of the things I like about Picori is that it has been very much a learning organization. That there's a lot of humility in the process. Like, yeah, we've come this far. we have a long way to go. There's farther to go. Let's pat ourselves on the back for a second and then just get back to work. And that the approach is, what is it people need to know to help or want to know to help them make decisions about their health, as opposed to here's the data we have. Let's figure out how to automate what's there.
Yeah.
And I think that's a nuance that's really important.
So what you're describing, by the way,
Yeah.
is the most significant difference between what I think is a data analysis approach to healthcare issues versus a data strategy approach.
Okay.
And I think there is, and I hope that I have done strategic data analysis. So it is not true that all data analysis is not strategic. There are things that are under the lamp that are absolutely worth looking at, right? But having said that, when you are thinking about what you are going to do next, and you're trying to change something about the healthcare system, invariably, part of the reason why whatever that thing that is broken, the reason it's broken is because there is no data being collected. In many cases, there's no incentive for the data to be collected, no mechanism for the data to be collected. It's on the other side of some difficult problem, and so a decision to commit to perhaps data gathering or data synthesis, or I think in some cases you might be able to use AI to kind of surface patterns that you don't see otherwise. But all of that is the strategic acquisition of the data you need. And so invariably, when I talk to somebody about, like, well, what is the difference between someone who is thinking strategically with data versus someone who is just is accepting the boundary of where the light is shining?
Well, let me challenge you on that.
Tell me.
I think that there is data that is that nobody is making money off of, that is readily available, that is open source, and that is community health data. That there is if we think about, instead of thinking about individuals, because all of this that we're been talking about is about individual level data and all the challenges. But if we were to include, and what I hope to advocate for with PCORnet and PCORI is that, that air quality by zip code, that there is environmental and social data by geography, by community, that's already out there, that would really help to inform health. But we don't really, we're not looking there. We're looking at individual level data and all the challenges of individual level data, which are tremendous. And it's a huge business. It's a trillions of dollar business. And so people are very jealous about their data and all the ethics and profit motive and whatever. But we don't look at this community level data, which impacts health.
So let's extend our I look for the keys under the street lamp.
Yeah.
Let's extend that metaphor, maybe perhaps where it should be extended. Okay. I think a good way to think about what you're saying is, there's the street that you lost your keys on, and there's an empty field next to that street, and then there's what the light shines on, which is a subset of the street, and indeed there's data out there that nobody pays attention, people devalue, and I think, for instance, let me kind of yes and you on what's in that little field that's not actually even on the street. It's not paved. It's not prepared. It's not thought of as healthcare data. Data on Yelp, reviews of restaurants and physicians and medical facilities on Yelp is, I think, a source of data that's ignored. Reddit and kind of other social media sites that are not merely user created, but user moderated, I think have an interesting, aspects of clinical data.
Proximity to fresh fruit and vegetables
Absolutely.
in your neighborhood,
Absolutely.
which is
Which you could
data
measure.
that would be
Absolutely measurable. And so one of the, I don't know, this is my apologies for getting too wonky here, but there was a FOIA request that I feel like should have been answered and was not. A decision about grocery data on food programs, and it established a precedent of what is available under the Freedom of Information Act, which is problematic because what we want to know is when we're giving out food programs, what's being bought on those food programs, and it would have shown a lot of light into the places where we have food deserts, and that data was denied. But there's a bunch of data sets, like for instance, the advertisements that grocery stores send out, or the digital information that everybody has in their Instacart. Places like this, and Instacart is actually releasing data, which is really interesting. So, and there's geolocation data, there's check-in data. I mean, we're awash in data and ignoring most of what we have.
I mean, the proximity of maternal care.
Yeah. To bus routes.
Right. I mean, so when I think about, take an area that's controversial and difficult in that realm, is a conversation that was had yesterday, or maybe it's happening today, is about the data about gun violence. Okay, so that in a way to me has similarities to the challenges of having data about patient goals and patient preferences. Or what works when I'm scared and what works when I'm in pain. Those are thorny problems.
Yeah.
They have political
implications.
They have data implications. But I don't know, maybe.
I mean,
but I'm just saying.
And just to be clear, there were prohibitions for years, and I think they've gotten better recently.
Yeah.
But there's been prohibitions of years for thinking about gun violence as a public health problem.
Yeah. So I guess to
there's
me,
all these lines.
Why don't we? So to me, there is, but just like we look at claims data, because there it is, and people have put a lot of work into it.
Agreed.
There is this other data, there it is, and that we could use it. And we could figure out how to integrate it, and create linkages, zip code, or, block, level, what block people are on, or people who don't have a home.
So let me reflect and continue kind of finish the conversation is, in some cases we have the data and we're ignoring it, and the problem is that it's uncomfortable to look at and think about and talk about. And I think one of the things that I really appreciated for thinking about behavioral interventions, and I'll try to find the links for this, but if you think about stopping a behavior, starting a behavior, or sustaining a behavior, those are not the same things at all.
Right.
Quitting smoking, starting exercising, and eating less is very, very different behavioral interventions that you want to think about. And so creating a useful set of distinctions. So I think it's really important to distinguish between data that you don't use because it is just too controversial. Controversial data. I think there's data that you don't use because it's too boring, right? Things that we ignore because, well, everybody knows that. Who cares?
Okay.
And I think then there's data that we ignore because it is not pristine and requires a bunch of data engineering to get working. So this is one of the patterns that I found. I'm fascinated by Reddit data. I'm fascinated by regulation data. I'm fascinated by all these things. And it's been a real struggle to get other people to be fascinated by these data sets because they are not available as a corpus in a way that can be easily downloaded. Because the people who do data analysis want to have pristine and clean data. I think there's a whole session, actually literally might be happening pretty soon here, about the problem of dirty data.
Right.
So we're ignoring it because it's dirty. right? Because it's not been massaged into something that's pristine, and I can import it into my favorite analysis engine. And then there's data that we ignore for other reasons. What reasons am I forgetting in my kind of taxonomy of data we ignore?
Well, let me spin that just a little differently.
Okay.
We actually have a ton of data and we don't use it. And that, to me, also is
That's the data we haven't gotten to yet.
No, it means data that we don't use, that does not, like, what is the purpose of data to me as a patient? The purpose of data is to help me decide what to do next for best health,
Okay.
to live an optimal life.
Okay.
And there are things that we know that we don't need data for, because we know, like, don't cross a busy street without looking both ways. We don't need to do research about that. We know. But so I'm trying to say that.
Okay, so let's
there's
data we ignore because we should ignore it. That's definitely a pile. There's a huge amount of data that we have that is not relevant. And I think the problem is it's not always easy to tell what is and is not relevant.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
So there's data we ignore because it's not relevant. I think there's data that we ignore because of bandwidth. Like, I think PecorNet is probably in this position. Yes. I'm certainly in this position. I have 10 to 15, not times, but orders of magnitude more data than I will be able to work with already with access to Medicare claims.
Right.
The Medicare claims is one of it's an incredibly rich data set. And I constantly learn new methods of approaching. But even if I only use the methods I knew, there's still 10 times more than I would be able to look at in my lifetime. So it's a huge field of data that I've been given access to under these programs. And of course, with privacy protections in place, both the systems that I use to access Medicare and the systems we talk about for PecorNet are using absolute best practices to protect patient privacy as we do these data analysis. But there's so much more that I could do. I could if I could clone myself 10 times, I could still spend 10 years with all my clones, me and all my clones, looking at just Medicare data, and I don't think we would run to the bottom.
Well, but see, again,
and that's just what I'm interested in.
Yeah, but I think it's like, to me, it's what are the questions you're trying to answer, and do you have, and so picking out what you need to answer the questions that people have.
I love this priority. That the patient needs to determine what to do next.
Yeah.
And that is an organizing principle for this data.
Okay. So when I was working, now I need to clarify that I was working on the Blue Button Plus initiative, which was not the first Blue Button, which was the VA. It was the subsequent, the next phase. So anyway, but that sort of got me started of being at the table of these conversations. And I thought, even though I am a early adopter, data wonk, I am also a supreme skeptic, obviously. And, but I feel like this stuff is important, and I like to communicate to my constituencies why I think this stuff is important.
Okay.
And mostly people don't give a crap. Like, who cares? It's just, we're in a bubble, you and I. This is a bubble. Most people don't really care about this stuff. But there is certainly a set of people that care, like people who are attending this conference.
Or people who are watching this video.
Right. But when I communicate, I work very hard at trying to communicate what this stuff is about and why it is important. The biggest response I have gotten, so like a mode response, not like 90%, but the largest thing is lack of trust. And when I burrow into why the lack of trust.
Here's what I found.
Oh, what is it doing? It's like recording I must have pushed the button. It was recording me. Why the lack of trust is because everybody who is vociferous about lack of trust. It talks about the data being errors in the data. So I'll bet you $1 that this dirty data conversation is not going to be talking about patient-reported errors in data.
I bet you it will.
Okay.
I bet you said it's a whole $1.
Yeah.
I can afford that bet.
Okay. And so, so people have,
but I do take your, no matter what, I take your point.
People have stories.
It's not clear that this will be, that aspect of dirty data is going to be addressed.
Right. And part of it is that even people like, I have a friend who's 4 feet, 9 inches tall, weighs 125 pounds, and somehow it got recorded that she weighed 215 pounds. And so all her coding has obese.
Right.
She cannot get that changed. I was worked up for cardiac disease for 25 years when it turned out I had MS.
Okay.
I cannot get my cardiac diagnoses off my record. These are fundamental errors that have huge implications. So there is no really good system to clean up stuff like that for activated people who want to clean their data.
And indeed,
and the more open notes we do, the more stuff we reveal.
Yeah.
And so it's not useful, even if I forget this guy's name, is all his optimism comes to fruition. Don Rucker, all his optimism comes to fruition. There are not ways. If people don't have faith in it, it's not going to get used. So let's
be specific, because I think this is really interesting. We're going to have a conversation about Dobbs. I think it's Dobbs. Dobbs was the case that and Kimberly talked to us about the cases in which Black Americans are having what amounts to discriminatory notes added to their records. And so we're getting these cases where medical records in various ways are being weaponized against patients.
Yes.
And what we're realizing, I think in some sense, the only silver lining of the fact that it's taken this long to have fluid data and to have data moving around is that interoperability makes data weaponization worse. So if you do not want to have the fact that you were pregnant but never gave birth to a child be a part of what is following you around from record to record, that's pretty important, because that could land you in jail.
Important.
And if you do not want that you are a difficult patient or a non-compliant patient or any of these kind of terms that are pretty offensive,
or not obese,
or here's an interesting one, that you have HIV but you don't, because you had an STD test that was incorrect one time,
right?
Or that you have an allergy that you don't actually have, or the opposite, where for whatever reason you can't get an allergy added. These kinds of, and I think it's a little positive, right? Because if you're missing an allergy, all that's necessary to fix it is to add it, and then that kind of sticks around. But if you need to remove an allergy, which sounds like it's unimportant, like who cares, right? But if you are not allergic to penicillin,
right,
and you have being allergic to penicillin on your record, it means that any antibacterial approach to you is going to be more intense potentially than it needs to be.
Right.
So, and there's tons of cases like this, where a piece of data that in the grand scheme of things, you might think is just an echo. Like, who cares if my doctor doesn't think I'm fat? Who cares if his EHR thinks I'm fat, right? Or obese or whatever it is. If my doctor knows that I'm not allergic to penicillin, who cares that his EHR is saying that I'm allergic to penicillin? And again, and I apologize, I want to make sure that we keep giving the information to you, the audience, but there is a right of amendment under HIPAA. So if you as a patient want to amend your record, you can send an amendment, and you can add something that's bolted onto the end of your record. And the best chance you have of getting this fixed is to amend something to your record that says, so in the penicillin example, I am in fact not allergic to penicillin, and you append that to your record. And what that will do is create a medical legal liability situation for your anyone who has the incorrect information in their record, your hospital, your clinic, even your physician, because then you have essentially the two contradictory facts at the same time, and one of them is right, one of them is wrong, and if that is unreconciled in one way or another, because potentially, right, there might be cases in which people want to amend their records with incorrect information. Just not every patient is a good faith actor too, right? So it's not clear who should win when an EHR record is at war with itself. But at least it creates the tension. But here's the thing. I think if you took 1,000 patients and you surveyed them, I think only 10 of them would know that you can append. You have the right to append. I think that might even be generous. And I think of those 10, I think if you took 1,000 of those 10, if you looked actually downstairs, you look at all the patients here and you ask them who has actually appended something to their EHR in order to correct incorrect information in the record, I would say it's a 1 in 100, if that.
Yeah.
It's very, very rare. So there's one pathway that we have right now, which is not digital. Mm-hmm. There's no API that I know of that currently supports this. I think that's something we're working on. We're actually working to do some work to surface that ability, because if we surface that ability from an API, maybe you don't even need to know that you have a right under HIPAA to amend your record. You'll just be solving the problem you have and not understanding that is mechanically what's happening. You might be able to use technology to surface that. And I think there's a lot of approaches that we're going to be trying, I think, in the next 2 or 3 years to do that. But that's the backstory of what Danny's talking about here, is that this is the policy and the options that exist are complex. They don't really work that way. It's kind of kludgy feeling. Do you have any comments or reactions?
I do. I think I see two major problems. One of the problems is that correcting errors is labor intensive, and we're in the short-term profit mode of healthcare, and adding labor is never anybody's priority. If we can't, add nurses, adding people to correct errors, it's just not going to get funded. And then the other side of that is that coding is benefited by complexity. And so if we want to take off that I don't have heart disease, there is really no incentive to accomplish that.
And not merely that, there's a counter incentive.
There's a counter incentive to do that. So I think it's, in all of this stuff, like here I am, I'm a gadfly, and I'm like, talking about all the things that I see as problems, because that's what I do. That doesn't mean that I don't appreciate all that has happened and all the effort that
Rucker.
That Don Rucker and all of us have been doing.
Yeah, I don't feel bad. I have trouble with
that. But what I think is we need a huge dose of humility about what all this actually does, and what it doesn't.
Yep.
And this, happy horseshit about how much all this can accomplish and how it can solve all these problems if we just got a little better at it is like not realistic. And it doesn't help to be so, we need a dose of humility about it. I think that's what I care about.
So let me push back some.
Okay.
I think the problem is what we need is some humble enthusiasm.
Yeah.
Because there's the other dimension here is, I think there's a lot of people who have poo-pooed for years the viability of interoperability, mm-hmm. and we have been fighting for so many years mm-hmm. to try to get this. And the idea, for instance, that you could take an airplane trip, and each airplane in the series of planes that you took would not be aware of the fact that you were coming from this place and going to that place, and then it would be totally uncoordinated, and
Right.
like that no one would think to make sure that the airplane that you were taking to on the second leg of your journey left after you arrived by some reasonable amount of time at the airport that was your bridge. Uh, there's just a huge number of systems that are so broken because they don't talk in healthcare.
Right.
And every patient I know has had the experience that is the equivalent of I flew from LA to Dallas in order to get to New York. And when I got to Dallas, I found out that my plane had left already by 2 hours because nobody cared to tell me that in LA. And they have an equivalent of that level of dysfunction in their and basically and I mean to intend like I show up, I'm expecting something to happen, it doesn't happen, right? Instead, I have to wait a day, and I have to pay to wait a day. And sometimes, like the MRI visit is well, that's going to be tomorrow, and the lack of coordination and correct flow through the system because the parts don't talk and refuse to talk has been such a tragic problem. We've been working on it so long that I do think that it's a reasonable criticism of me and Don and other people who are pretty much every ONC there's ever been, not just Don. There is an enthusiasm that is probably not fully warranted, that doesn't acknowledge the problems we will create by connecting those systems in ways that there's going to be a lot of unintended consequences. But at the same time, it's not like we're going to solve those unintended consequences or make things better by keeping everything disconnected.
Yes.
Right. So
I'm with you.
So what I want to probably the right state, the right quadrant in this two dimensions that we've talked about is humble and enthusiastic, because we need to take this leap. We need to jump in the deep end. There is no way to learn this without going into the deep end.
Right.
We need the enthusiasm, but we also need to know that this is not going to turn out the way we think it's going to.
Right.
The only thing that we know for sure is that we don't actually know for sure how all this stuff's going to turn out. But we need to be also cognizant of the fact that we are, I think there was a letter from the Nokia CEO. We're in a burning pier situation. Like you're on an oil rig, the oil rig is burning. You're gonna have to swim or you're going to die. Right? We are in that kind of a destitute situation. The complexity inherent to being a patient, the complexity in healthcare is unsustainable. And the number of cracks in the healthcare system there's more and they're growing bigger. And if you are lucky enough that you have had what the healthcare system understands well, like I joke with my standard joke, makes all the patients at these conferences laugh is, boy, don't you wish you just had a stroke and you just had a heart attack and you just had diabetes and you just had, kind of these standard problems. You just broke your neck, because we know how to deal with a lot of these problems that are common. But as soon as you get just even a little bit off the map, as soon as you get a disease where it's, well, I thought it was this, but then I thought it was that, and then I thought it was this, and it was 2 years where I just had no idea, and then finally someone came up with a solution, and those are the lucky ones. Those are the ones who make to the conference. The people who don't figure out what the diagnosis is don't even get to go to the conference because they're dead or miserable or requiring full-time care. Right. So the cracks in the American healthcare system, especially, but I think this is true in other countries as well. As the healthcare system gets more complicated, as issues like COVID and long COVID and new chronic conditions come, and in some cases, we're victims of our own success. Like we're all living longer, so we're having new age diseases that we've never seen before. But all of that increases the complexity, and as the complexity increases, the places where you can get lost in the healthcare system also increase. And so we need to have data working for us, and we need to have it liquid and moving around, because it is the only thing we can do to improve this problem of handling complexity and keeping patients out of the cracks. But I take your point. I do. I take your point about just blind enthusiasm there is probably unwarranted. Is that a fair? What do you think?
Totally. I mean, I don't want to. People are working so hard on all this stuff. I guess I think the value of having people like me at the table is that some of these questions of so what are asked. Because I know, I mean, I think so. I'm on the board of PCORI, and I think, and I feel like I represent patient and caregiver stakeholders, and I am still a two-legged old cisgender white man of privilege. And what do I know about most patients and caregivers? Nothing. And the challenge to stay in touch and that to be sure that we are asking and trying to answer the questions that people have. What are those questions? What is a 13-year-old? What are the questions a 13-year-old has? What are the questions that somebody who is, has developmental disabilities? Or caregivers of development? What are the questions that they have? Are we answering them? And having people who are asking those questions at the table is really important.
Well, I think it's really important, and I think it also, like, these organizing principles. I think some of the organizing principles that you're talking about are part of the universal condition. What is it that helps me when I'm in pain? What is it that helps me when I'm scared? What scares me as I think I've got almost all the ones you had: cisgendered, totally living a life of privilege. Absolutely. What scares me is not the same thing that scares another person.
Right.
And
really, what scares me today is different than what scared me
5 years ago.
And
what will scare you in 5 years?
Right. So, So I understand why those things are very difficult and why I got blown off.
But at the same time,
they're still important.
It upsets me that you were blown off.
Yeah.
It upsets me that you were blown off about that. And in defense, first of all, I don't think you should have been blown off. What I think the conversation should have been is, I'm not sure that this technology is capable of addressing these kinds of big questions. That's not blowing you off, but it's actually kind of trying to wrestle with the question. And then, of course, if you had not been blown off and been asked that question, you might be able to come back with, well, probably not completely, but maybe partially. Can we talk about how we can do it partially?
Right.
And so those are really useful things. But I think those organizing principles, because I do think that people go into the data and it's a huge amount of data. And there's a lot of useful things to do. It's hard to figure out what the most useful thing is to do, and having some kind of organizing principle. Let's start up here at these things that patient are really impacting patient experiences. I think that's a great way to think about it, and a great way to kind of sum up our stream. Do you want to say anything else before we get off?
Thank you.
All right.
This was great. I appreciate the opportunity.
Oh, well, you're certainly welcome. And thank you to the audience for listening to both of us.